I trust everybody's here for the Burlington Wine Club. Come on. Okay. I don't think there's anybody on the call that hasn't met me before, but I'm Teresa and I'm the club Somm. And if you haven't been here before, we're recording this session, but you can turn off your video and then you won't be seen. You can ask questions throughout, and you could just type your question in the chat box. Marilyn is the co-host, and she will collect the questions, and if we get an accumulation of them, or it seems that we could have a break or need a break, then she'll stop things and voice the questions. Speaker mode and gallery mode are different views. You can choose either. So, and try them both out. Okay, sparkling beverages. So you have 2 sparkling beverages in your kit: the Growers Meadow Peach Orange Blossom and the Good Fortune Raspberry Hibiscus. So hopefully, spotlighted. Okay, my host has spotlighted my video for me. Who knows what that means? Anyway, so whether you have one or the other or both, cheers.
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 I have the raspberry hibiscus, which is wine-based and delicious. And I hope you noticed, so everybody got the Lay's Classic. We finally found a source for the regular potato chips as opposed to the assorted chips. So hope you like that. Okay, birthdays. Actually, that's wrong. It's Dorothy's 37 and holding. Not Dorothy, she's 37 and holding. And it was Martin's birthday this past month as well.
Me too.
Oh, that's oh, okay. All right, you'll have to send us your birthdays. We're going to collect, in fact, if everybody would like to send their birth dates, we'd really appreciate it, because we're going to start collecting birth dates, especially come January next year. You know what? We're going to be back together each month, and we would love to recognize birth dates throughout the year. Okay. So the year is encouraged, but not required. Anyway, so okay. So we'll add Lola to that as well. So recent events, Paragon Beverage Group was here, International Wines. And I think we pretty much sold out everything that they had to offer, and some people ordered additional cases as well. Coming up, we've got, oh, it's funny. So we've got Tacos and Tequila, Chef Mike, August 15th, a live event, our very first live event. If you want to register, so you folks that have been on the video calls have first priority, and I think we have about 15 people signed up already. Tomorrow morning at 8 a.m., a message is going out to the wider distribution list, and we're limiting it to 30 people. So if you do want to attend and you haven't signed up, you have between now and 8 o'clock tomorrow morning to sign up. Okay. There's also an additional event that's just come to my attention today, and that is the International Wine and Food Society, another club that I belong to, is having their first live event at Joshua Creek on August 11th. I don't know all of the details yet, but if you're interested, but stay tuned. If you're interested, it's going to be nice wines, high-end appetizers, should be a really interesting event. And if anybody would be interested in attending and joining me in it, just let me know. And when I have more details, I will let you know. People have been asking me about what's going to happen down the road. So the plan is that we're going to remain virtual all this year. So we've got August, September, October. Our plan is to remain virtual for all 3 events. And then the Christmas party is in November. My thinking is we're still going to be virtual. For one thing, it's going to be cold in November, and so things have to be indoors. And so I'm thinking virtual still. So this whole year we're going to be virtual. We're just going to be safe, give everybody time to get their shots and everything. And then come January, I'm really hoping we're going to be back at the art gallery. And the art gallery is equipping themselves to do hybrid events. So we can have an in-person event, and if you still want to be on a Zoom call instead of in person, they're putting in the technology to facilitate both. So I think that's very exciting. I think that's a lot of fun. So for those of you that joined us just electronically or on Zoom calls and don't necessarily want to join the in-person meetings, you can stay on call. So we'll figure that out. The one thing I will say though is it will be the policy, everybody needs to be double vaccinated to attend in person. Okay, so just to let you know, heads up on that. Tonight we have Arterra wines, and they all came from the Burl Oak wine rack. And our speaker tonight was originally the winemaker responsible for quality control at Arterra, Marco Piccola, but he couldn't be with us tonight. But I am very, very pleased that Elsa Macdonald is going to be joining us, and I'll tell you a little bit more about her in a minute or two. Actually, right now. So we have the 3 wines. We have Elsa. So Elsa is a gal. I just spoke to her for the first time today. But she is a gal near and dear to my heart. She is she's a professional in the industry. She's a wine educator and she's a wine traveler. So in the world, there are less than 400 masters of wine. In Canada, there are half a dozen or maybe 10, and there are only 2 women, and Elsa's one of them. Yeah, so she's a newly minted master of wine. It's an awesome credential. And if I were 30 years younger, I would follow in her footsteps. So she's a wine educator. So she teaches, again, near and dear to my heart. She teaches the WSET. She teaches wine professionals. And she teaches at different schools, and she's the wine educator for Arterra themselves. So that, and wine traveler. Oh my goodness. There are 4 countries she's been to that I haven't. So she is very well traveled. Anyway, so I'm really, really pleased to have Elsa Macdonald here. Unbeknownst to her, I have run into her at a number of different events over the last few years, but we've never been formally introduced. So anyway, Elsa, welcome. We were absolutely thrilled. And the other thing I will say, folks, is because Marco was unable to attend and it was very last minute, Elsa's actually on vacation and she stepped up to join us here tonight. So Elsa, awesome. Welcome.
Thanks for the introduction, Teresa. And there is no connection. We happen to have the same last name, but apparently there's a few McDonald's around. So
yes. And you're a little D and I'm a big D.
That's right. That's right. But I couldn't help today saying Teresa Macdonald. It's Elsa Macdonald calling. So there you go. So welcome, everybody. I'm kind of excited about this tasting. I didn't pick the wines. They were chosen before I sort of stepped in, but I can see some of the thinking that Marco obviously had going on, because you've got quite a broad selection covering a couple different areas. We've got Niagara, we've got Prince Edward County, we've got a way to kind of compare and contrast some of these wines. So I think it's going to be a fun tasting. I'm actually doing it outside because I decided I'm on vacation, so I should be outside as much as possible, even though it's actually quite cool today. So I'm in Toronto in my back garden with my little Canada flag behind me on the fence there. And nothing makes me happier than to have to open 6 bottles of wine on a Friday night. So there we go. So you have 3 whites, and we're going to start with the Sandbanks Pinot Grigio. So I'm assuming everybody has that poured. So Sandbanks, the winery, is actually located in Prince Edward County, and it was started by an amazing woman who she's actually from Quebec. Wine was always a part of her life. And she was very excited in early 2000s to buy 7 acres of property in Prince Edward County. And people thought she was nuts because back then, you know, there was very few people that were doing it. But it was just this dream that she had. And I think part of it was also, you know, being outside, being on a farm, and so on. And so she planted a few varieties that would work in the area. I'll talk a little bit about Prince Edward County versus Niagara. And Teresa, jump in if you think everybody knows what I'm saying, or if this is interesting to people, because you know, many of you are probably gardeners. I got a new house in November, so I'm a gardener for the first time, and there's things that I've been saying to people, and now I suddenly realize, you know, that part of the garden gets a whole lot more shade than that part. And so even though I have the same flower and they're 30 feet apart, the way they grow, the way they blossom, how much water they need is completely different, and that's just in my own backyard. So Prince Edward County is a little bit farther north than you might normally think you'd want for a vineyard. Usually they're a little bit further south, so a little bit warmer. But the reason it works is that the county, the whole peninsula is actually out in Lake Ontario. So it's surrounded by water on 3 sides. And what that does is the water has this moderating effect. So the summer isn't quite as hot as it might be, but the important one is the winters aren't quite as cold. Because when we have our winters and they get down to kind of -20, that's when the vines start to die. And they just don't make it through the winter. And basically what happens is any moisture that's in the vine will freeze, it will expand, it'll split the vine, and that's game over. It really can't recover from that. But because the county is a little bit, it is actually water on 3 sides, it gets that moderating effect. You don't kind of get the ice all the way around it. And that's why we can grow there. But when you look at the varieties we grow there, it tends to be things that don't need as much heat to ripen. So Pinot Grigio, Chardonnay, a little bit of Pinot Noir. A lot of people are actually doing cider up there, things that are apple-based because it's a little easier to grow them. People are also doing a lot of sparkling wine. So it's super interesting. Now, I think Catherine figured out pretty quickly if she wanted to grow, she was going to need to source grapes further than from her plot that she had there. So she actually will also buy grapes from Niagara, bring them up and blend them with something locally, or even just make it 100% from Niagara. So you'll notice that the appellation on this one is actually Ontario. I'm not sure, can you guys actually see me, or do you see the screen right now, the flight one? You can see me, you can see the bottle?
We can see you.
Okay. Oh, yeah, you're good.
Okay. So you can see it says VQA Ontario. So VQA, you probably all know, means Vintners Quality Alliance, and it basically is a designation that says where the grapes come from. So if this was just from Prince Edward County, it could have Prince Edward County on there. But because it's a blend, it has the Ontario on there. If it's just from Niagara, it will say Niagara Peninsula. And then, as many of you probably know, Niagara Peninsula is further subdivided. So we have a lot more designations there. I think everything tonight is for, yeah, the rest of them are Niagara. No, one of them is also Ontario. So we'll come back to that fact. But let's have a taste. Enough of me talking about it. Pinot Grigio is an interesting variety. Pinot Grigio and Pinot Gris are actually the same grape, just grown in different circumstances. So when you have a Pinot Grigio, it tends to be lighter in alcohol, higher in acid, and the flavors tend to be more at that kind of citrus, green apple end of the spectrum. When you have Pinot Gris, it's going to be more like 13 and a half, maybe even 14% alcohol. It's fuller body. It's going to have much riper flavors. You could even be getting into, you know, maybe some stone fruit. Your apple, instead of being a green apple, is probably a yellow apple. So what's interesting about these three wines that we're having is they all have different versions of Pinot in them. So the first one is a straight Pinot Grigio. Let's have a taste.
And I'll interrupt just for a minute, Elsa, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
So the creamy Parmesan pasta goes with the Pinot Grigio. The idea there is it's creamy. The Pinot Grigio should cut the creaminess of the pasta, but try it, check it out.
It's an interesting thing. We have three wines with different levels of body in them. This is, I would say, probably the lightest of the three and the most crisp and the highest acidity. So sometimes when you're pairing with a pasta, you want to cut that fat, cut that weight, but sometimes you actually want to complement. So a fuller bodied wine can also work. So try your pasta with the other, with wine 1 and wine 3, because I think they will both work with it, but just in very different ways. One's more of a contrast and one's more of a complement.
Yep.
So I don't have the pasta in front of me, but
absolutely.
That's my guess.
Yes, and again, and good point, Elsa. If try each of the food pairings with each of the wines.
Like this would be awesome with, I'm assuming this would be awesome with your green salad with your strawberries. This would also work really well with that. Sometimes when I'm doing food and wine pairing, I'll try to get an image on my wine, image in my mind of what that wine is to me. And this first one, I get lots of green apple and pear. And so if I think about if I had food and I was putting green apples and pears into it, like putting it into that salad, it would be a very complementary flavor. So sometimes I think of it that way. I remember someone also saying to me, you could also think of that as being like a squirt of lemon. So if you had food and you wanted to put a squirt of lemon on it, that would be a wine that could work in that way. So that's kind of fun. And the last thing I'll say is you might notice in your Pinot Grigio, it's not the palest white wine you've ever seen. Sometimes you have Pinot Grigio and you're not even sure if it's water. But Pinot Gris, when it hangs on the vine, it actually turns a pink color. So when you see it, sometimes you might think it's almost an underripe red grape, but it's just because it has that darker skin, but it's still officially a white grape. But that's why we have a little bit more color in that first wine. Okay. Shall we talk about wine number 2?
Absolutely.
So Pinot Noir. So you'll notice that Pinot is the same word for Pinot Gris and Pinot Noir. So it's like the gray Pinot and the black Pinot, if you directly translate it. And once upon a time, these would have been the same. They were all Pinot, and they will have mutated over time to become what they are. But they became very stable, and so they have maintained themselves as distinct varieties. So the Pinot Noir, as soon as you pick it up and smell it, right, you're getting all that fruit. You get the lovely strawberries and cherries, bit of raspberry. There's also something maybe a little bit leafy, if there's such a thing as like a strawberry leaf. So as I'm saying those words, I'm wondering if I'm actually being, it's being suggested to me when I look at the food pairing that Teresa did. Because in terms of flavors, it works particularly well. But the other reason I think it works is depending on your dressing. If you have a dressing that has vinegar in it, that can be challenging to any wine. It's not about this wine in particular, but any wine is challenged when you have vinegar in your food. So quite often, instead of vinegar, I'll use citrus, whether that's grapefruit or lemon, or sometimes I'll even use orange. I'm trying to remember.
Yep. So in this, so they were given a dressing to go with this, and it's a finishing oil and a white balsamic. With salt, pepper, mustard, the usual.
Is there any sweetness or the impression of sweetness from that white balsamic maybe?
Yes. Yeah.
Oh, how fun. What I love about this wine is the linearity, right? It goes straight down the palate. And so you've got the fruit going on, but it's crisp and fresh at the same time. So I just think it's delicious. Teresa, do you want me to talk a little bit about how rosé is made, how we get the color in it?
Sure.
So obviously we know Pinot Noir normally as a black grape variety that makes red wines. And here this is obviously a rosé. And basically the way they control that is when we're making a rosé, we're probably going to pick the Pinot Noir a little bit earlier than if we were making a red wine with it. And we do that so that we keep some of that acidity, we get that freshness, but it still has to be at the point where we've got enough of those aromas and flavors have developed enough. We'll pick the grapes, put them in the press, and we'll watch it very closely. We will crush them. We'll let the juice and the skin sit together for a while. Sometimes it's as short as 2 hours. It could be 4 hours. This one I suspect is relatively short because it's such a pale pink, but sometimes you see some that have some rosés that have a much deeper pink color. It will be because the skin and the juice stay together for a little while, for longer and longer. So the deeper the color, usually the longer that it's actually sat on the skins. And when it's sitting on those skins during that cold maceration or cold soak stage, it's pulling out the color. It's also pulling out some of the flavors. And then we will pull the skins off and finish the production the same way you would for a white wine. So on a white wine, you have your grapes, you press it off the skins right away, take the skins out of the equation, and you go through fermentation and then whatever you're going to do afterwards. With a rosé, once you pull after that time that it's spent on the skins, you pull it off, and the rest of the process is more like a white wine. So what do I mean when I say more like a white wine? The fermentation is happening in stainless steel, so we're trying to keep the oxygen away from it. It's done at a relatively cool temperature, because when you ferment at a cooler temperature, you're keeping all of those fruity aromatics. As the temperature goes up, that starts to get a little bit compromised, but what you get for that is texture. So when we go on to the third wine, we're going to see that there's quite a different texture here, and that's because some of the wines in the third wine were fermented at a slightly higher temperature to get a little bit more texture. But before I jump forward, any questions about the Pinot Noir Rosé? It's an interesting choice of grape, Pinot Noir. Quite often, if you have rosé from the south of France, it will be a blend of Grenache, Syrah, and sometimes a little bit of Mourvedre, but usually the Grenache and the Syrah. But I think rosé has just taken off in the last sort of 5-8 years, and people are making almost any red grape variety. They're trying to make a rosé with it. But for me, I love the Pinot Noir because it has that beautiful fruity nose and that really crisp acidity. So you can have it by itself, or you can have it with food. Just love it.
And I'm with you. The Pinot Noir rosé, I don't know. There's something, and I like the European rosés, dry rosés, but I think in Ontario, our Pinot Noir rosé is awesome. And I think Enniskillen's version is great. So mixed green salad with strawberries. So folks, tell me, so did you taste the strawberry in the Pinot Noir rosé? And does it work with the strawberry in the salad? And was the dressing okay? Not too much?
So I think there's resounding success on the salad, Teresa, and certainly the dressing was a triumph. It wasn't too heavy. The white balsamic, that's just mind-blowing in my house. We're going to be ordering some of that. Maybe Elsa or Teresa, we remember that Pinot Noir, the heartache grape, difficult to grow, expensive. Can you talk at all about the choice of using that as a rosé? Is that a bold choice, or are we past the curve in Niagara on Pinot Noir?
I think so. Pinot Noir, they call it the heartbreak grape because it has a very thin skin and it is very susceptible to any kind of mold, little bugs. It's really, when it's good, it's really, really good. And when it's not great, it can be very, very sour, very, very acidic and very tart and just absolutely heartbreaking. And you can have a beautiful season where it's growing perfectly. It's very, very healthy. It's right on track for ripening. And then suddenly you have a couple of rainy days followed by a little bit of heat. And so that encourages all the mold to get in there. The other thing about Pinot Noir is it has really tight bunches. If it gets a little bit of mold in there in the spring, which can happen, it might go dormant and then your bunches grow. And then suddenly when you have that sort of hot, humid snap later in the season, it just explodes from the inside. And it's always devastating when that happens. Do I think it's bold to use Pinot Noir for rosé? I think you are more likely to be successful with a rosé because you're picking it a little bit earlier. so you're not risking it hanging out on the vine. What you do risk is, I don't think people know it as well. They don't think about Pinot Noir for their rosé. In fact, I don't know every consumer, of course, but I think consumers think of rosé as a wine. They don't think about it. Whereas when they're talking about their whites, they want Chardonnay, they know they like Sauvignon Blanc, they know they like Pinot Grigio. When they think about rosé, it's just that pink category. So I think it's probably safe on those two fronts. So I'm gonna bring the mallet down on it. Was a good choice.
And an excellent price point. Folks, just to remind you, the first two wines, the Pinot Grigio and the Rosé, both $15.95. So great to introduce to friends, great to have in your cellar for when friends drop by or when it's Friday in Ontario. All right, we want to move on to my favorite, the P3.
Okay. So P3 is called this because there's actually 3 different Pinot grapes in there. Almost half of it is Pinot Noir. I just want to make sure I'm not lying to you. But then we also have Pinot Gris, not Pinot Grigio, but Pinot Gris, right? So that riper style of it. And then there's a little bit of a third one called Pinot Blanc. And those 3 grapes are picked separately, vinified separately, and then they're brought together at the end. And each of them has their own thing to contribute. So they'll change the blend a little bit depending on the vintage and how the grapes have brought themselves forward that year. But your Pinot Gris is bringing body, it's bringing weight to the wine, it's bringing a bit of texture. That will be vinified at a slightly higher temperature so that it's encouraging it to get a little bit more texture. The Pinot Noir is bringing some fruit character to it. Now, certainly if you compare the aroma of wine number 2 and wine number 3, you don't get that Pinot Noir jumping out of the glass in the same way. You don't, but it is absolutely there. And then the Pinot Blanc is all about the acid. So that's what's making it a little bit more refreshing. Because the Pinot Gris, we've now left it on the vine a bit longer to get more of the riper fruit character and that body. It drops a little bit in acid. So having that punch of the Pinot Blanc kind of brings that back into balance. So I would say this is by far the fullest body in the group. A little bit heavier on the palate, a little bit fuller, kind of gets into all the corners of your mouth, but still very crisp and refreshing. And again, you'll notice it has a little bit of that pink color.
So Teresa, why the mushroom quiche? Maybe you can.
So the mushroom quiche. So Pinot Noir and mushrooms are a classic pairing. And even though it's not all Pinot Noir and it's a blend, I think this wine holds up to something a little bit more substantial than a salad or whatever. And I don't know, the flavors, so it's mushrooms and onions and butter and cream and eggs and pastry. And I don't know.
A bit of richness. Yeah.
Yeah, a bit of richness.
Yeah.
Anyway, and my only addition to this is, so I love the P3, and typically I will serve it in a large Pinot Noir glass. To me, that's the presentation of this wine, the light pink, but it's full-bodied. I don't know. So try it in a large Pinot Noir glass sometime.
How did that one taste? As I say, I don't have the food in front of me, but how did that one go with the pasta versus the Pinot Grigio? Did you get the idea of the difference between, the complement and the contrast a little bit? You picked some really interesting foods there, Teresa, so it's kind of fun to mix and match with.
I think that definitely, Teresa, you've hit the tasting notes. Is there any, I get a different version, so is there any cheese in the mushroom quiche? So there would be Parmesan.
So yes. So you have, so in the non-cheese version, you have the vegan version.
Thank you.
So it's an egg substitute, and it's Dale, the cheese that you gave me, grated, that you recommended. I use that, and I used fake milk. I forget what kind. But for the regular mushroom quiche, it's mushroom, it's onion, it's Gruyere cheese, it's cream, and it's eggs. So it's very rich.
Got
And
it.
even the gluten-free version is just all of that without the crust. We accommodate different dietary things. To let you know, Elsa.
So Elsa, and you can tell me if you're not in the ability to answer this question. Until this Inniskill and P3, I had never seen these three together. Is it common, uncommon?
It's very uncommon. It's
Okay.
absolutely uncommon. Yeah. Sorry, I've just lost my visual here, but you can still hear me, obviously. Here we go. What was I doing? That's what I get for fiddling around with my view. Oh, there we go. You're all back.
Right.
No, it's very uncommon. And in fact, this was something that Bruce Nicholson dreamed up because, we're always looking for ways to innovate, to have something a little bit different. Niagara as a region is often looking for, I don't want to say their identity, but, looking for ways to keep coming back and visiting the wineries and trying things that are different. And I think this is something that we can do uniquely well because all three of those grapes grow well in our region. And it gave him some flexibility to play with it a little bit. So, yeah, it's very.
So I think he did an excellent job on this. Like the P3 is one of our favorites.
Mm-hmm. And another follow-on question, Elsa, and again, feel free to say this is outside of your. It is the heaviest damn bottle I've had to hold in a long time, and it has a punt that goes practically to my wrist. So there must be some thinking behind that. You wouldn't do that just happenstance. Do you happen to know what the thinking is there?
So at Inniskillen, we have different, what we call tiers of wines, right? Different price points, different themes, and so on. And of course, what Inniskillen's best known for, of course, is ice wine, and that's what they export internationally and so on. But this comes from a group called the Discovery Series, and that is when I was talking about innovation, coming up with new things, experimenting. Usually they come in at a slightly higher price point because there's less of it and there's a lot more risk associated with it. And so to go with that, people seem to like to have a heavier bottle because it's just quality. As a winemaker, I don't think Bruce would particularly care one way or the other. If I'm being honest. I'm also looking at the vintage here. So that was a 2019. So it would have been bottled last year. I will tell you that with COVID, there has also been a lot of switching around of bottles. You might notice some wines that you normally have are in one bottle are showing up in a different bottle this year. It's because there have been glass shortages and shipping and timing all over the place. But this one will just be because they wanted to use a more substantial bottle just for the quality of the wine inside. The punt in the bottom, I have looked that question up and talked to people about it so many times over the years. And it used to be, the quality of glass that we have now compared to 100 years ago is really night and day. And once upon a time, the glass would have been, I don't know if it would exactly be hand blown, but it was produced in a particular way that there would be imperfections in it, and it could break a lot more easily. When they were, before they had filtration and those sorts of things, often you would have settlement and sediment forming in the bottle, and it would form around the bottom of the punt, and that was why it was there in the first place. Also, if you were turning the bottles while they were aging, it made it a little bit easier to figure out where you were turning it from. And of course, because, look how much space there is, it makes the bottle look bigger. So all of those things together is the history of it. But the truth is, it doesn't really do anything anymore. It's just, yeah. So we don't actually, I suppose the other thing it would do is that you could stack bottles on top of each other. So when they were laying down in the cellar, not in a rack, it would give them a little bit more stability so the whole thing wouldn't fall over. So that's kind of the role of the punt, why they all still exist. Yeah, you'll see on the bottom of all the other ones, very, very small punts.
You're right. So, folks, that $20.95 available at the at my Sobeys at the
Wine rack.
At my wine rack. It's fantastic.
The wine rack.
And I can tell you, if you're looking for something to take as a gift, you don't know what they're going to have. They don't know if you're white people or if they're red people. The bottle is impressive. The wine is exquisite. It's very reasonably priced. It impresses for sure. And I've done it this week. You just take it along. People have not experienced it. It's Niagara, and I think it's a beautiful, beautiful wine. Teresa, are you feeling like you want to move on to the reds?
Absolutely. So any questions about the whites before we move on?
I just wanted to address there was a question that I saw in the chat about that the punt was there to collect the sediment, which it was, but in a wine like this, the P3, you're not going to get sediment out of that, right? There's the sediment happens because the tannins are starting to fall out, and that's usually with a red wine. Very seldom will you have it, and certainly not on a young fresh style like that one.
Yeah. Okay.
Thanks for that. So everybody flip over your place cards. We're going to the reds.
Okay. So the Enniskillen Discovery Series, Cabernet Shiraz, and barbecue sausage kebabs. And I have to say a special thank you to Lorraine, and she's not on the call tonight. She's gone off to cottage country, but she barbecued all the kebabs for us today, or yesterday. Anyway.
You guys are spoiled in your club. That's awesome.
Oh, I have half a dozen awesome volunteers.
We are spoiled, that's for sure.
We are.
Awesome. What's fun about this one is you'll notice on the bottle that it's actually called East-West Cabernet Shiraz. And the reason for that is at Arterra, we have vineyards in Niagara, but we also have vineyards in the Okanagan. And so this is very unusual. It's not actually even classified as a VQA. It's not part of Vintners Quality Alliance because it can't be. Because as I said, Vintners Quality Alliance, and then the name of the appellation tells you where the grapes come from. So we have a VQA designation for Ontario, one for Niagara, Prince Edward County, Okanagan Valley, even a couple sub regions within the Okanagan Valley, but there is not one for all of Canada. So this is actually not a VQA wine, which is quite interesting. But we wanted to do it anyway because we thought it was such an interesting blend because, you know, here in Ontario, it's considered a cool climate. In the West, it's considered a hot climate. And so the way Cabernet will develop there versus here and Shiraz there versus here is very different. So bringing them together gives you a wine with a little bit more dimension and certainly a very, very unique flavor. And that was why it's part of the Discovery Series and why it says East-West on it. So Cabernet Sauvignon in a cooler climate, you're going to feel more of the tannin, more of the acid. You'll get a little bit more of that green herbaceous character, and it will have a slightly more moderate alcohol. In the hotter climate, it's going to be fuller bodied, higher alcohol. It won't have so much of that herbaceous character. It will have more of that black currant cassis character that you're expecting from the Cabernet Sauvignon. Now, Shiraz, on the other hand, in a cooler climate, it gets this peppery note. And that peppery note, and I literally mean like black pepper. It will also have black cherry, blackberry, a lot of black fruits in it. But when you go to a warmer climate, take that same grape variety, the Shiraz, and instead of having the black pepper, it will actually become more of a licorice character. So by taking, and the structure will change as well. In the more moderate Ontario climate, it's going to have higher acidity. In the West, it's going to be a little bit softer, a little bit rounder, a little bit juicier. So by putting them together, one is bringing a little bit more structure and the other one is bringing a little bit more ripeness. So it's quite an interesting way to mix and match them. So there's two cabs from the West. There's a cab and a Shiraz from the West. They're vinified there and then brought to Ontario, and then they blend the two together. So for me, I get a lot of that black currant, black cherry on the nose. I do get a little element of that slightly green herbaceous character. It's not dominant in any way, but there is definitely some herbaceous notes in here. This is, I think, 15 months. Yeah, 15 months in oak. So you certainly get that kind of vanilla toast character from it. And it almost gives an impression of sweetness on the palate, although the wine is dry. Truly
a barbecue wine. And I love the Discovery series or the East West series where they're bringing in the BC wines and the Ontario wines and marrying the two different climates. Like they produce, I don't know, better wines, great wines.
Well, it's funny when you look at styles of red in Ontario, just because of the ripening season that we have and the temperatures that we achieve. So the sort of shorter season, it does get very hot, but not for a particularly long time. A lot of our reds do end up being slightly lighter bodied, which some people love because they find it very refreshing, works really well with food. And other people, they're looking for that fuller body, that, you know, that extra punch. And this is a way of us creating that here. So it is a fun idea, if not a little bit unorthodox.
Oh, unorthodox. That's a challenging word. Is it really? I mean, in terms of the industry, is it something that in Canada we tend not to do? We want to stay regionally. We just want to explore that a bit.
I think it really depends. Some people, they are creating a wine that's all about the terroir in a particular location, and every single thing they do, they want to exemplify that one location, and so they're very kind of pure about that. Whereas other people, they want to make something that's interesting to them, or, you know, has a chemical reaction that they've never seen before. And I don't mean chemical reaction, but, you know, the flavors blending together, the textures blending together to make something that's different, that's not necessarily about terroir. It's about the ultimate flavor of the wine. And there are consumers who love different styles. So there's certainly an appetite out there for both, I think, to exist.
Right. Thank you for that. That's a very interesting perspective. Are you supporting the region and the terroir, or are you supporting the overall result? And maybe as consumers become more knowledgeable, it's the ultimate result that may win.
I think so, but I also think that it's about occasions. You know, sometimes I you know, have the intellectual capacity and the group around me and the time that it can be all about the wine, and then all I want to talk about is terroir. But other times I'm having a party and it's very social. We're outside, it's a barbecue. Nobody's talking about the wine, right? They're all just talking about, you know, whatever. COVID, yeah.
And
wait for new conversations beyond COVID.
and speaking of barbecue,
Yeah.
so the barbecue sausage kebabs were the food pairing for this particular wine. And I think that's, to me, it was a good barbecue wine, barbecue food. But you guys tell me.
And there was a little bit of vegetable in the sausage as well?
Of course, sausage and peppers and onions and whatever. It was a kebab. Yeah.
And those nightshades, you felt, well, you know, just enhance the barbecue aspect. Is that why you chose them? The onion, the peppers, and nightshades.
Oh, yes. So, well, first of all, I guess when I think of a kebab, I think of a combination of and roasted peppers and roasted onions alongside whatever meat or plant-based meat it comes with is just a natural combination. And if you have just all of one, it's a bit too heavy. So it's, yeah. And if it was even all vegetables, I would argue that this wine would work with it on the barbecue, grilled with spices.
Mm-hmm.
I often find wines that have a dimension of oak in them. So whether that's a Chardonnay that's been oaked, or like these first two reds that have some oak in them, you know, the thing that people prize on their barbecue is getting those little black grill marks, and that toasted with the wine, it's sort of, they enhance each other.
Right.
And so,
Exactly.
yeah. Because a lot of the time people think, oh, what am I going to have with my, you know, steak, for somebody who doesn't like red wine? I have a sister who just does not like red wine, period. We just find her a full-bodied chard that's got a decent amount of oak, and sometimes heavier than some of the red wines that we're serving. So it'd be really an interesting way to think about it.
Yeah.
So we're right about 8:15, which keeps us on track. For any of you that are looking for a chef tip, if you're doing a grilled vegetable only, if you've got someone in your group that doesn't have meat, just take a little bit of liquid smoke and put that on your vegetable, and you're going to enhance that barbecue flavor as well, and maybe enhance the oak in your wine. That's just a little chefy tip. So that wine comes to us at $17.95. You can see yourself picking that up on the way to a friend's place and really dazzling that. We have 8 bottles left in inventory. If it's something that appeals to you, we'll get you an order form after tonight's event. So the next on the mark is Jackson Triggs Shiraz. You want to lead us through that, Elsa?
Sure. So Jackson Triggs is a fascinating winery. If you have the opportunity to visit down in Niagara, please do. And they have kind of 2 tiers of wines. The first tier is what we call the Reserve. It's a black label. You can buy it at Wine Rack. It's very affordable, very food friendly. And the next tier up is what they call the Grand Reserve. And the difference between the Reserve and the Grand Reserve is the fruit that's been a little bit more coddled in the vineyard in such a way that it might achieve a higher level of ripeness. And because it has that more concentrated flavor, quite often there'll be wines that have a little bit more oak. So where the first one we had was 15 months of oak, this is more like 18 months of oak. And you can actually taste the oak when you taste this wine. You get a little bit more of that vanilla toast character coming forward. But I think it's nicely in balance with the Shiraz. And planting a grape like Shiraz in Niagara is pretty bold. You know, Marilyn was asking me earlier, was making Pinot Noir Rosé bold in Niagara? Not so much. It's, you know, your chance of success is pretty high. With Shiraz, it can be a little bit challenging. But what you'll notice, this one, especially compared to the first one, is you do get a little bit more of that black pepper note coming through, and that's because of the way that the Shiraz is developing. You'll also notice that the tannins aren't I'm trying to think of the best description. You notice the tannins are there. They're a little bit chewy, but they're a little bit more, they're quite velvety. Whereas the first ones, there was more tannin, but they were a bit softer. And that's that sort of Okanagan tannin that's a little bit more ripe coming through compared to this one. I love your pairing that you did with this because usually a cheddar will have like a slight saltiness to it. And when you have those tannins a little bit more apparent, the saltiness will actually soften up those tannins a little bit. So hopefully you've had the chance to try that wine alone, then do it with the cheese and try the wine again, and you'll see it actually will improve it quite a bit. So that was a insightful choice there, Teresa. Did I take away what you were going to say?
No, not at all. So the only other thing I'll say is I always like to reinforce the difference between Shiraz and Syrah. And I would question why this was not called a Syrah.
I have the same question. To me, this is much more of a Syrah style than Shiraz. And I think that comes down to a lot of people don't know what you just said, Teresa, that Syrah and Shiraz are the same grape variety, and people are looking for Shiraz. You know, they don't realize that it's actually the same thing. So I think that was one of the reasons for it. There was a couple of vintages where we actually had both a Syrah and a Shiraz. So I thought that was very interesting in those years, because it would be just which part of the vineyard. But as it turned out, we didn't really have enough grapes to keep doing that every year. So we just do the one, and they just pick that name. But I totally agree with you.
So, and I was talking to another Ontario winery a couple of years ago, and they had called their wine Syrah, and they were told by the LCBO to change the name to Shiraz because it would sell better, even though it was not that style. So anyway, I was just curious.
It's always that push and pull between how much are you hoping that the consumer is going to invest to understand, to come to know it. I mean, it's kind of unusual for a group like this to come together this often and talk about wines in this depth. I think it's awesome. And to me, all it does is make you love wine more and more every time you probably come to a session, and you just want to know more. But there's a lot of consumers who they're not really interested in being educated on it. They just want to enjoy it. So just give me something I'm going to enjoy. And so it's always that sort of.
And this is the name they're familiar with, so this is what we're going to call it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So this is.
I'm always going to push back.
Right.
It's Teresa's favorite thing, the Shiraz Syrah. There's a song about it, but we'll do that later.
Yep.
So $25.95. It's a wine that suggests that you might have it for a while. Is this a wine that, if you bought 6 of them and had one a year, is this a wine that you could enjoy over many, many years?
Yeah, I think it is. I think, when I'm looking for a red wine that's going to age, it's got to have a bit of tannin, it's got to have a bit of acidity, and it's got to have a decent concentration of flavor. And this has all 3 of those going for it. And each of those elements is going to ripen a bit differently over time. And so how they interplay with each other, might shift a little bit. And so that will be what gets interesting about the wine over time. But no, I certainly think that's got the legs on it to go the distance.
Excellent.
And I always love that idea of, buy 6 and have one a year every year and just write your notes, shove it back in the box and see how it changed the next year.
Well, we do have some inventory, folks. So if you are feeling like you want to make that commitment to your future self, we're happy to help. Now, Marquette is a wine that we've had here at the club, but not from, I think, this region. We've had it from PEC. So
right.
Maybe, Elsa, you can guide us through this very unique grape and the audacity of Thomas Bright.
So,
And the history of Thomas G. Bright. Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
So way
Perfect.
back in 1874, believe it or not, they were growing grapes and making wine in Ontario. And Thomas Bright was one of those winemakers. And he had a small company in Niagara, which, eventually a lot of the small companies came together. And finally, in the early 90s, Vincor was established. And Vincor brought together Inniskillin, it created Jackson Triggs, and it brought the whole Cartier, Thomas Bright, I'm trying to think of some of the other names, but there was many, many small wineries that came together. And some people ask, this is not a very well-known fact, but I find it quite interesting, is how is it possible we talk about in Ontario that we have a monopoly, yet we have all these small little wine shops, right? We have the wine rack, and there's 165 wine racks across Ontario. We also have, there's the wine rack, there's another one called the Wine Shop, which is from a company called Peller, and they also bought many of these small wineries. Every time you bought a small winery, you got what they call a farm gate license, which means you had the right to sell retail at your farm gate. And even when the LCBO was introduced, because all those licenses were before the LCBO came into being, they grandfathered those licenses. And that's why we're allowed to have that small retail chain that we have. So I always find that very, very interesting. You can imagine in those days, somebody growing grapes and making wine, it was quite revolutionary. I mean, we talk about that with Inniskillin when it was happening in the early 70s. And this was, 100 years prior to that it was, that it was going on. It was obviously stopped for a long time with prohibition, but when they were thinking about, let's try and innovate and find some things that consumers are interested in and, create a brand that has permission to do things that are slightly weird, slightly unusual, totally unexpected. That's how we came up with the idea of a brand called Audacity. And we named it after that original pioneer, Thomas Bright. And you can see that sort of reflected in all of the imagery on it as well. I can recommend from this, we have actually an orange wine, which is basically a wine made like a red wine, but done with white grapes. So you remember how I said when we're doing winemaking and we press the juice off of the skins very early in the process? Well, if you leave the white skins on the juice, they will actually become an orange color, and then you actually get a little bit of chewiness, almost like tannins from it. So we did that under the Audacity label because we thought that, there we would have the right to experiment a little bit. And Marquette was particularly interesting because you remember I talked about both Prince Edward County and Niagara having these very cold winters. there are certain pockets where you can't plant Pinot Noir or Cabernet Sauvignon or Merlot because they'll just die year after year after year. But there is a different type of, different species of grape, which are hybrids. And the hybrids are actually much more, they're native to North America. Many of them have been crossed and you know, to take some of the winter hardiness and also the ability to ripen very quickly. And Marquette is actually one of those. So it was created in Minnesota. It was developed to be a winter hardy grape, yeah, and to ripen quickly and offer fruit quite easily. And so there's actually a little spot at the back of, some of you, I don't know if you're that familiar with Jackson Triggs, but once upon a time we had a single vineyard we called Delane. And at the back of that vineyard, the grapes would just keep dying and we just couldn't figure out what to do. So they put some Marquette in there thinking, let's just see what happens. And this is the result. So,
Oh,
yeah. So it was one of the few times that our marketers kind of said, have we got anything really interesting we can play with? What about Marquette? And the guys in viticulture said, you must have been reading our minds. We planted it 2 years ago. So there you go. So, I mean, we would have had Marquette in Niagara before that, but it would have gone into some of the blends. It would have been not necessarily called out on a label because it would be a very small percentage, but it really was a great grape in some of those tough parts of the vineyard. But I think what they've done here is quite interesting, and you do get that chocolate note when you smell it, which is quite interesting.
and
it's easy
and it's now considered VQA, is it not? The Marquette, right?
But you'll notice,
Which is new.
But you'll notice it's VQA Ontario. That's because it's a hybrid grape. So even though the grapes do all come from Niagara in this example, they don't call it VQA Niagara because the hybrid doesn't, that's considered a higher level of VQA, and the hybrid grapes don't go there, which is quite kind of interesting. You probably never even noticed that. You might notice on a lot of our sparkling wines, they're also just the Ontario designation, unless they are traditional method, and then they can have the Niagara Peninsula versus Ontario for the tank method sparkling.
So is this something that we as consumers and wine lovers should be looking for? This is the first I'm understanding about the different levels of VQA. Maybe you could.
I think it harkens back to that discussion about there's so many different occasions when you're drinking wine, and sometimes you know, lighter, easier going, less expensive red is absolutely what you want, and it's something different. So
100%. And so, Teresa, aside from the fact that we always end on chocolate, maybe you can expand on your rationale for the pairing with Marquette.
Yes, because so initially I thought Marquette would be first, Cab Shiraz, and then Shiraz, and that would be the order. And when I tasted the wines, I reversed them or changed them. So to me, the Marquette has some sweetness, some almost end of the evening kind of wine that will go with the chocolate, or if you have cheeses, that this is a perfect wine for those. The Shiraz, okay, so lamb would be better than cheddar, but cheddar is strong, and the Shiraz is a full-bodied Syrah. And the Cab Shiraz, to me, was a barbecue wine, and then you end with some of your nicer wines and end with your sweeter wine. That was my thinking. Pardon?
I think there's a lot of people who are having wine without food. And so when you're having red wines without food, that little touch of sweetness, and it's not a lot, I think it's 10 grams per liter or something. So there is a touch of sweetness on the end of the Marquette, and it's because a lot of people are drinking it without food, and so it softens it up and makes it a lot more palatable. But you've kind of taken those cues and done an interesting pairing. Can I ask what kind of chocolate it is? Is it milk or is it dark?
Dark chocolate.
right? So the bitterness in the chocolate,
Yeah.
and it's not too sweet. It's not too sugary sweet, the
Nope.
chocolate, because that would compromise any wine. One thing I will say that's kind of interesting is if you taste the Marquette and then go back to the other two wines, the other two reds are going to seem a lot more astringent just because you've had that sweetness, and sort of the next mouthful
Yep.
can seem quite tart. So it's interesting to go back and forth. But yes, to end on the one with a touch of sweetness is a great idea.
And that is $17.95, which, to my thinking, a unique wine. Again, if you're going to pick it up and bring it to a friend, I don't know, Elsa, if you have any thoughts on its ageability. I don't feel that, but I'm not the master of wine, clearly.
But I think your feelings are, I would say the same, right? It's about being fruit driven with that touch of sweetness. It's ready to drink right now. Drink it in the next year, 18 months. I don't think it doesn't, while it does have the acidity, it doesn't have the tannin, and the flavors, it's the fruitiness that is the first thing to go in a wine. So if it has lots of texture and depth to it, that's okay because it's got something else to go on. Whereas this one, it's just much easier to drink.
Yeah.
And it's not going to have that depth. It's just a character difference.
Let's drink it today.
Yeah, so we have 8 of those left. If you're interested, I've taken it again as a gift as a hostess gift, because you can present it, and not many people know about Marquette, and certainly to have it here in Niagara, what a thrill. Not that there's anything wrong with Prince Edward County, because we're all Ontarians, but thank you for introducing us to that. So Teresa, that brings us to about 8:35, just about. Everyone's loving your pairings. If you want to wrap us up, I think we're just on time to do that.
Elsa, thank you so much. So thank you for coming off your vacation. Thank you for showing up at the last minute. But more importantly, thank you for being who you were and for all that we learned tonight. Awesome.
Great pleasure. Thank you for having me.
It was,
I hadn't heard of your club before, but obviously everybody is enthusiastic and loving it, and nothing makes me happier than meeting people who love wine. So very nice.
and I would love to touch base with you again.
Okay, you know where I am.
I do now. Anyway, co-host Marilyn, always, you're my right-hand person. You're just awesome. Food and wine kits. Oh my goodness. For the first time, the whole group was back together again, and it was amazing. Dorothy, Lorraine, Kathy, Carl, Anne, and Marilyn, you picked everything up. So we had, anyway, it was, the food group was back, and it was a happy, happy day of preparing food for everybody. Anyway, it was just good. Wine buyers, so there are a few wines left of some of these wines, and then obviously all the wines are available at the wine rack. If there's anything that you want after you've tasted it, let us know. Next month, international wines again from Vinex and Vintage Trade. That's it for me.
Thank you, Sharon. I'm going to, we're going to change the view to gallery view. As is our custom, if you have something that was a favorite tonight, we like to do a cheers. So I will, if you have your glass, I will count you down. I'll give you 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. Everyone, cheers to your Sante. Thanks for everybody keeping us together since April of 2020.